welcome to this podcast, What's Your History? I'm your host, Kelly Hunter, and on this podcast we cover all areas of history, no matter how big, how small, how well known, or how niche. My guest from this episode was Dr Emily Hansen. She studied early modern grammar schools and got a PhD at the University of York doing medieval studies. I hope you enjoy her episode. It was a fascinating subject, a subject I don't know much about, and I hope that you will go away learning something about this subject just as I did. Enjoy.
Hello, Emily.
Hi.
So, early modern grammar schools, it's a very niche thing. What actually drew you to this subject to begin with? What drew you to study this particular area of history? Why grammar schools in particular? Why English grammar schools as well? Would you like to share your thoughts on that?
I suppose I was always I always really enjoy learning. In my life right now in the present day, and I've found it fascinating to see what would other people's experience of learning be in the past, and early modern England. I'm not quite sure why I found that so interesting. You're just sort of drawn to something. You can't really say why. You just are. But the grammar schools, I found those particularly interesting because they're actually quite well documented. Not as well documented as I would like, as we'll see. But you find that if you're going to find historical evidence for education in this time, it's often going to be of grammar schools. So I was finding, when I was doing my undergraduate dissertation, I was finding that a lot of the source material that was available was to do with grammar schools. And I thought, actually, this is really quite interesting. And I learned a little bit more that a lot of these schools that were founded in the 16th, late 15th, 16th, and early 17th centuries. Sometimes they might even be even older than the early modern foundation date. And also, a lot of schools that are around now actually date back to this period. So they're founded in the early modern period. So just knowing that this is a period of time where we see a lot of development in education, I find that really interesting as well.
The title of your thesis is From Humanist to Godly, the Changing Social Function of Education in Early Modern English Grammar Schools. You did touch briefly on about the fact that schools are obviously funded. What is the difference between humanist and godly? What was the process of that as well?
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it might be worth explaining what I mean by that title, because it's nice and catchy for a title, but it actually kind of gets us thinking about some of the developments in grammar school education from the late 15th and through into the 17th. So you have kind of two significant influences on education in this time. And one of them is humanism, and one is the Reformation. And I don't want to oversimplify this by saying yes, there was humanism and there's the Reformation, but those are two things that are having a lot of influence on what kind of things get taught and who receives this education. So humanism is referring to this interest that develops during the Renaissance in just classical Roman and Greek. Classical culture and literature, and Latin literature in particular, and Greek as well, and so that starts to have more of a perceptible influence on grammar schools towards the end of the 15th century, and obviously grammar schools had taught Latin before, and they've been around long before the early modern period begins. But there's this new interest in wanting to learn Latin as really as well as the ancient Roman authors had done, and how sort of trying to write to this similar standard to them, and a lot more interest in those sort of Roman educational methods, and an interest in learning Greek as well, which you don't really see so much in prior to this period. At least not as much as you do in the early modern times. And even then, Greek is a very much more of an ideal rather than something that actually manages to get into the curriculum and practice. But that's a whole other thing we can talk about later. So humanism, yeah. So back to the question, which was humanist to godly. So humanism is the influence that you see on education towards the beginning of the period that I look at, which is roughly about sort of from the 1480s. Is kind of when I pick up, because that's when you really start to see that humanist influence kind of start to be most visible. And then the godly bit comes in when you think about the effects of the Reformation. And again, I'm slightly oversimplifying this, but basically, if you think of sort of later in the 16th and into the 17th century, you've got quite a strict Protestantism, and it's about kind of godly behavior, godly living, just following that following quite a strict Protestant line. You sometimes see the term Puritan and godly kind of used interchangeably. Puritans didn't call themselves Puritans; they preferred to use the term godly to describe themselves.
Okay.
So yeah. So I suppose that's a really long-winded way of talking about how, at the beginning of at the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the period that I study, humanism is your big influence, and then my focus kind of tails off towards the middle of the 17th century, and that's when you start to see sort of more quite strict kind of hardcore Protestant values. I'm not really sure this is making any sense, but it does make sense in my head. You know that there's a big question mark in that, from humanist to godly.
Yeah.
So yeah. So is it really as simple as looking at a humanist influence and then something more heavily Protestant?
So with the fact that it was becoming more Protestant and that was taking more influence later on, did that affect the sort of subjects and things that the students were learning and that the teachers were providing for their students as well? How did that influence what they were learning?
So how did the Reformation impact grammar schools? This is an interesting one, because there's kind of been an assumption that it affected grammar schools quite a lot. So when the Reformation it starts on continental Europe, and you see certain places there, it takes quite a firm hold in terms of education, in terms of the influence that it has on education. That's what I want to say. So for example, in sort of like German speaking countries, where the Reformation begins with Luther, there's a lot more Protestant influence in the curriculum, and that's not really something that I'm know as much about. Certainly Martin Luther had quite a vision for his what education ought to look like, and it kind of fell short from that, but you still see a lot more influence in places like that, a lot more Protestant influence there than you would ever see in English schools. And also in Scotland as well, there's a lot more sort of influence there of in terms of religion, and also in terms of other countries are teaching more Greek as well. So coming back to that humanist question from before. Whereas in England, the Reformation isn't really as visible to the students in terms of what they're actually learning about. Where you do see it is it influences why schools are founded. So you see a lot of, for example, in the one of the sources that survives quite commonly is the statutes and rules and all legal documents that would be used to found a grammar school. And in the preamble to those, you will often find that the founder wants to they're very concerned with bringing children up in virtue and manners and good true religion. And sometimes there are clergymen as well, like bishops, for example, who found schools up in the north of England, because the Reformation was, people were still a little bit more religiously conservative there. And so they considered the North, the ignorantest in religion, and they want to, try and found these schools, try and get people on track with the official religion, Protestantism.
So what sort of people? What were the sort of people that would be going to these schools and funding them aside from priests?
Oh, okay. So who's going to the schools and who's funding them? Two questions here. Two good questions. So who's going to the schools? Again, this is I think it's another misconception that people have, and I don't know where it comes from. Well, no, I do know where it comes from. Is because it's actually middling sort. Because thinking of like the middle class is not really, it's kind of a bit anachronistic for this time period, but you can speak of the middling sort. So these children are not wealthy, but they're also not, poor in the sense of just sort of being, poor farmers' children. So middling sort, they're going to these schools, and they're always boys. So that's the crucial thing here. And then in terms of who's actually establishing these schools, again, it's people from that same sort of social background, but they have to be, or often they're even people who are more wealthy. So someone who has the money to leave behind, perhaps in their will, possibly, because some of these schools are founded in people's will, and that money they'll often leave land that's worth a certain sum of money, and that the rent off of that land is what funds the school. So students don't end up actually paying fees. It's the schoolmaster gets paid and everything from the land. And sometimes you'll see like senior clergymen founding schools. For example, I think of some northern examples. Archbishop Holgate's school, for example, in York, is one. 1546. Again, the Archbishop of York, Robert Holgate, he establishes the school, and there the rules and everything for that survive in the Borthwick archives at York. So those were some of the first ones that I read actually for my thesis. Oh, and sometimes you see women founding schools as well, which is pretty cool, because obviously they would not be able to have gone to these schools, and yet they're doing this as kind of it's like a charitable sort of thing. They're leaving the land or the money to establish a school.
Oh, well, that's pretty good that they're able to do that, at least to helping out in some way. I mean, like you said, unfortunately, women did get a kind of an education, but not on the same level as a boy, because women. But yeah, so you did touch briefly on being a schoolmaster and everything. What would have been the kind of like the school schedule sort of thing? Like what was it a good job to have to be a schoolmaster? Was it good at all? Is it something that people no?
No. So a few things there. So what did the school day look like? So we have a fairly good idea of that from various sort of the rules and things that survive for schools. They'll often walk you through in quite a bit of detail what exactly should be taught, and that's how we know that religion actually shows up in a fairly minimal way in the curriculum. There's prayers at the beginning and end of the day, and they study the catechism and take notes on the sermon and go to church on Sundays, but otherwise there's not a great deal of religious instruction sort of in between. Otherwise it's very much sort of classical Latin and Greek. But we also know that the school day was very long. So they're really taking advantage of the natural daylight hours. They're mirroring the adult working day. So you'll see schools starting as early as 6 in the morning, 7 in winter.
Jeez.
And going on for till maybe that same time at night. So
could you imagine children today starting school at 6? I know that they do like breakfast club and stuff for children, but not necessarily starting at that time.
No, that's they have a really early start. Quite a long lunch break though. Don't know if that makes up for much. And they'd also be going to school on Saturdays as well. And then often going to church on Sundays.
Would they go to like a Sunday school on a Sunday?
The evidence that we've got is they're meant to go and listen to the sermon on Sundays and take notes, which they then might be asked about, tested on the following day. So it's a really long day. There doesn't seem to have been sort of a set time of year to start the school year. You just kind of joined kind of whenever. You'd have a couple of weeks holiday at Christmas and Easter. But you're spending a lot more time in school than today.
Is a grammar school a bit like a boarding school? Would they have stayed there as well?
Not necessarily. Some schools might have done that. Some would have done, but not necessarily all of them. Yeah. And what was the original question? So what did the school day look like? And then the schoolmasters, wasn't it?
Yeah. What was it like to be a schoolmaster? What was it, a good job? Was it not?
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
Yeah. So with the school day, it's also very like the methods of teaching that they used were very much about repetition and memorization and rote learning. And like when you're learning a language, that's great. Like that can actually be really helpful. But that was just, it was very much, listen to the master give a little lecture, and then you have to repeat the lecture from the day before and memorize your grammar rules. And they're often doing a lot of like debates and declamations, disputations, so anything to kind of get them talking and practicing their Latin, and also practicing how to make a persuasive speech, or how to make an oration. Rhetoric is the term. So the schoolmaster, he would have come from a similar sort of background, social background to the boys, had a similar kind of education, so he would have gone to grammar school. Some schoolmasters, we don't know a lot about their background, but for the ones that we do, they would have gone to our grammar school and then moved on to university and done a degree there, perhaps even a master's degree. Some schools wanted that level of education, but not all. They're often very very specific in these the founders' wishes for their school that they founded. Very specific about what kind of person the schoolmaster should be. They're very concerned about his morals and his religion. That he be of the true religion. That he's Protestant, and they're more concerned with that. Actually, I've said they want him to be Protestant. That was not the case during Mary's reign, where she was wanting the schoolmaster, of course, to be Catholic. So that's an exception there. But yeah, they have to be whatever the official religion was. They have to be very morally upright in their life. Some schools insist the master not be married. Some say that he should be married. So it very much depends kind of on the founder whether that's allowed or not. But there's not any kind of formal training that a schoolmaster had to undergo. Sometimes some schools will specify he has to have been to university. Some might even specify what kind of level he should be, like whether he had a BA or an MA. But some don't at all. And it's just there's some debate about whether you can call teaching a profession in this period, because there's not this kind of shared training, the same sort of standards that teachers nowadays would go through. But in terms of whether it was a good job or not really, because you see a lot of people. I say a lot of people. There's a few main educational theorists at this time who are writing about teaching, and they talk about how hard it is to teach. Like what a thankless job it is. This tiresome, moiling and drudging, thankless Sisyphean task. They say that it's so important, but when you actually get down to it, it's just really quite thankless.
I'm sure a lot of teachers will be able to relate to that today as well.
For sure, yeah. It sounds like a really important job on paper, but when you actually get to do it, it's not. And what you find is a lot of schoolmasters will teach for a little while, early on in their career, and then they'll go and do something else, which is what they wanted to do in the first place. So they want to join the clergy. They want to have a job in the church because it's much better paid. It's better. It's kind of more highly regarded. And in the beginning of the 17th century, there's such a need for Protestant clergy but the job market becomes kind of oversaturated, and you have all these well qualified men who all want to join the clergy, and they can't because there's not enough livings for them, so they have to just work as schoolmasters. So looking at the careers of schoolmasters over this period, it is surprising, and it's also not surprising, the fact that sometimes they will just teach for a really short time. You might have men who are known for something else entirely. Perhaps they worked their way up and became a bishop, for example, or someone fairly high up in the church hierarchy, but actually they spent time earlier in their life as a schoolmaster. Kind of like a stepping stone onto. You're not likely going to find a young boy saying, "I want to be a schoolmaster when I grow up." Like, it's not that kind of aspirational sort of job.
Okay.
Basically.
That's a bit of a shame.
It is a bit, yeah.
Well, as like you said, with it not being that a very thankless job sort of thing, and we've just established that it's pretty much the same principle as it is today in a lot of places. Like, a lot of people want to become a teacher, but they found that the hours are long, not necessarily the same length as it was back then, but the hours are obviously quite long because you have to work even after school times and stuff now and stuff for a teacher and things. But yeah.
Yeah, and it even, you think about the school hours as well, but also these masters would also perhaps be the only one in charge of their whole, like, quite a large class, like larger than today. The numbers of the schools really vary. You might have maybe, say, 2 or 3 masters teaching upwards of 100 students, or a much smaller school. It really, the sizes of the grammar schools really vary. And you might have an assistant. The assistants were often called ushers because they sat kind of at the back of the room and, like, ushered people in. The schoolmaster sat at the front. So they might be lucky and have an assistant. The assistant might just be an older student, which sometimes happens. But not always. Sometimes he might be a university-educated young man who's, maybe hadn't gotten into a teaching, like, schoolmaster's job, but he was working his way through as an usher. The usher might sometimes be the first choice to succeed the schoolmaster when the schoolmaster left. So he would just come and step into his place. So you're also supervising, a large class, all doing different things. So they're all teaching at different levels. It's like kind of, the one-room schoolhouse kind of situation where you've got to manage the young boys who are just learning their grammar, and then, although the usher might help you with that. And then the older boys who might be learning Greek, for example, depending on how sort of wealthy the school was. So yeah, it's a lot to manage as well.
What other subjects would the children been learning? So you're saying they're learning Latin, they're learning Greek, they're obviously doing a little bit of religious studies. Would they have done mathematics? Would they have done any forms of science or anything like that, maybe?
No. Nothing too much apart from Latin and Greek. Depending on, they might be sort of exposed to some mathematics, perhaps depending on the books they were reading. You get a lot of classical authors writing about those topics. And some schools do mention, actually, that they might teach a little bit of mathematics, particularly if almost as an alternative to the classical education. Like, if you have students who, if they're not really cut out for the Latin and the Greek, at least teach them something. Teach them how to read in English and how to write and how to do some basic maths. So yeah, there's not sort of a separate subject of math, any kind of mathematical instruction like we have now.
What about history and geography? Would they have done? No.
Not so much, unless it came up in these classical texts they were reading. So they're not really getting a whole lot of history about they're getting a lot of ancient Roman and Greek history. And there are efforts later in the 16th century. There's a history of England. That's written. The name of the guy who wrote it is I can't remember it, but he writes it specific. Christopher Auckland, that's the guy's name, and he writes this this history of, like, England, and it's in Latin, and it's meant to be used in a grammar school, but at least it actually deals with English material, rather than just Greek and Latin. But the majority of it is Latin all day, every day, and Greek comes in sometimes. it's very much an ideal. It's quite often what you'll see with these foundation documents for the schools is that the founder will say that they want Latin taught because that's just what he did, and they'll specify all the authors that they want. The grammar book, after 1540, everyone was using the same grammar book, Lilly's Grammar, and it was everywhere, so ubiquitous that they don't even need to name it. We just know, yeah, it's the official grammar. But with Greek, they might list some authors that they would like to be taught, but there's always this idea that you might not find a master who knows Greek, particularly early in the 16th century. St. Paul's School in London, for example, they talk about having a master who knows Latin and Greek, if such may be got. That's the word in the wording in the statutes. Basically, it's if they can find a schoolmaster who knows Greek, great. But they know that they might not be able to. They might have to just content themselves with someone who just knows Latin, because it's very much an ideal. You don't have the printers who are able to print in the Greek alphabet. You have to have that typeface to make the books. So the books have to come from the continent. You don't necessarily have scholars who know the language. Again, they have to go over to the continent to learn it quite early on. So Greek takes a little while to take hold, and it's very much this ideal. Like the school wants to teach it, but they're not necessarily going to be able to do so. And it's often only the very wealthy schools that can do it. And it kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier about how there's a misconception that the grammar schools are for the very wealthy. The schools that were able to teach Greek were schools like Eton and Winchester and Westminster, these schools like that have become, they were known even then as the great schools, but they weren't founded for the really wealthy. It's my favourite fact about Eton is that it was founded 1440, Henry VI founds it, but not for the posh boys. It's for, boys of more humble background who are going to train to be priests. But anyway, there's this sense even then that there's like some schools are wealthier than others, and today those are the schools that you see the very wealthy kids attending, and I think that's possibly where this comes from, that oh yes, education must have been for the rich back then. And the answer is a little bit more nuanced than that. It was actually more middling sort, and the rich kids were tutored at home. But anyway, I'm digressing slightly. Edit that out.
So the fact that you decided you wanted to study early modern, why in particular early modern? Why not be before that point, or even in the time period there was like boarding schools, there was obviously rag schools, they started becoming a thing later on and stuff. There was obviously specialist schools because there were schools for girls as well by this point. So why that particular point in history is of interest to you? Why not earlier? Why not later?
That is a tricky one. Because I was just always sort of that period, sort of that transition from the Middle Ages into something that's slightly different. I don't know what it is about the early modern period. I really don't know. I think no, I'm not sure why that period in general. I think why that period for education. I suppose it's because it is an important time in the history of how education develops. I think there's been maybe also there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding education in this time as well that I think actually have a lot of the answer, as with so many things in studying history, the answer is usually more complicated, more nuanced. And it's this idea that, oh yes, education at the Reformation. Yes, the Reformation was so important for developing education, and suddenly there was suddenly an interest in wanting more people to learn to read. That's not quite the case. And it's also maybe a little bit more true of other places in Europe than it is in England. So there's a lot of sort of things to unpack, I think, with early modern education. And also I just think it's so fascinating that this is so much that still survives now in terms of the schools that are operating today. So many of them date from that period, but also the the early modern schools, they have such a long history themselves because so many of them might be re-foundations of earlier schools that were actually much older. And they may have had they may have had some kind of a connection to perhaps a religious house or a chantry or something like that. And so when those were abolished at the Reformation, those schools lost a crucial source of income, and so they had to be refounded with a new source of income. And so that happens a lot. So actually, some of these foundations that sort of date their way back to, I don't know, the reign of Edward VI, for example, they might actually be a lot older. And there you go, now you see a lot of schools. The King Edward School in such and such a town, or King Edward VI Grammar School, there are lots of those.
Right.
Because,
wow.
yeah, Edward and Elizabeth are the two Tudor monarchs that sort of, a lot of schools are founded in their name. The others maybe a little bit less so, and it starts to tail off under the early Stuarts as well.
Is there any Mary schools?
Yeah, Mary was she had a few founded in her name, sometimes jointly with her and Philip, which is interesting. She was actually requiring schoolmasters to be licensed by the clergy and insisting on some of the things that we attribute to Elizabeth's reign. Actually, Mary was doing it first.
Oh, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, only for Catholic schoolmasters.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Is there any grammar schools still standing that you like? What's one of the best schools that may or might not even still be standing? But what's one of the schools in particular that you've done a lot of research into that just really made you go, "Ooh, I want to know more about this particular school"? Is there anything like that you may or may not have seen? Because I know we do know that some of them are still standing.
Yeah.
Just want to know what if you have a favourite in a way sort of thing. Is there any?
Well, let me think. I like the fact that there's a few in York that date back to, well, there's Archbishop Holgate School that we mentioned earlier, and actually I really like this one because it was originally founded in one of the little streets behind the Minster, Chapter House Street, Oglethorpe, that kind of little corner there. There was a church as well right next to it that's been demolished since it was demolished in the 16th century. And so the school was originally there. And then it moved out to roughly where York St. John University is now. And now it's way out, like at the East Campus, complete other end of town. But I love walking past this walking down Chapter House Street and thinking, right, Archbishop Holgate School was here somewhere. Where was it? I wish I knew. I love that. And there's also some schools that I've actually been into for research, which was quite interesting. Magdalen College School is one in Oxford, and so it was Magdalen College still exists because it was one of Oxford's colleges, and I have been in there before, but the school exists as well on a modern site. So that was interesting, just kind of seeing where the site in the college grounds where the school was. And then just knowing the school is still flourishing away just a couple of minutes down the road. And then there's the schools so it's Shakespeare's School in Stratford upon Avon. It still operates as a school, but they have, the old classroom. It's not quite set up exactly as it would have been in his day, but very close. And it's in sort of this original building. And that was really cool to be able to see. If you go on a tour, this sounds so pretentious, but if you go on a tour of Eton, which I did this one time because it has an archive, you can see an old classroom, and it's actually a really good example of what a Tudor classroom would have looked like, or like sort of Tudor and late medieval, because it's got the desks sort of all ranged round the edge of the room, which Shakespeare School, they put them in rows, which isn't quite accurate to the time. So yeah, the old classroom at Eton College, that is a really nice example of a surviving school. And then Hawkshead School as well, up in Hawkshead in the Lake District. that's, again, it's kind of marketed a little bit more as, you know, Wordsworth's school, so it's laid out kind of more in an 18th century style. But that is another example of a school that was founded in the late 16th century by a clergyman who really wanted, you know, the North to have a, you know, slightly better understanding of Protestantism. So yeah, that was fun. Just going to the grammar school museum because that's fun. I think it's fun.
Brilliant stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for sharing with us your topic of interest, your history of interest.
Yeah.
It's been really lovely learning more about this particular area.
Excellent.
I didn't know anything about this before. Most of my knowledge of schools, which is very basic anyway, it tends to be more Victorian style, more rather than early modern.
Yeah.
Probably one of the other questions I have to throw in before we close this off is like, you've mentioned some of the schools in particular that you've seen and liked and stuff like that. I understand that these other schools that I'm going to mention are more seen as colleges, but what about like Cambridge and Oxford and stuff like that? How does that kind of translate in regards to the grammar schools? Did they learn the same sort of stuff? Do you know?
Yeah.
And all that sort of thing, really.
Yeah. So what we see with a lot of the boys who are attending grammar schools is that they will, not always, but very frequently, they will then go on to one of the either Oxford or Cambridge. Those were your two choices back then.
Right.
For the universities, and then they continue learning a sort of, you know, Latin, Greek. Hebrew is actually another language that we didn't really talk about, but that's again one of those ideal sort of things. Tended to be, you know, clergymen's sons who might get to learn Hebrew, so it's pretty rare. But yeah, so that classical curriculum, it continues on at Oxford, but there's a little bit more interest there in sort of other subjects. And university education it's not really sort of my area of expertise there. Once the boys have left grammar school, they're not my sort of they're out of my remit. But it is really fascinating knowing that again you see colleges at Oxford and Cambridge founded during this period, and some that are much older. And a lot of the schoolmasters that we were talking about, they will have gone to university. And often the most sort of, if you look at lists of students who went to grammar schools, and if you could kind of work out what they ended up doing, because we have, you know, it is rare to find this kind of material surviving, but we do have it. And where we do, the most common path is they went grammar school, university, to joining the clergy, you know, going into the church. That was sort of the ideal, you know, that career path was really common. So the universities are all kind of part of that path. And yeah, often they produced too many potential clergymen, and some of them had to spend time being schoolmasters first.
Oh dear. And as we've already established, that was a thankless task.
It could be. I mean, some schoolmasters did it, you know, they taught for life, but a lot would sort of move from one job to the other, or from that to the clergy, or they'd go and do something else alongside. You know, schoolmasters who worked as practicing physicians as well, or were like MPs and doing all kinds of other stuff, where they'd write things like texts about usually about grammar and about sort of stuff that would be practical for their students. But they're published authors writing some of these texts that they were actually originally written to be used in the classroom, or like dictionaries and things like that to make their students' lives easier. So they're also, you know, writing about the subjects that they teach. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for your time.
It's all right. Could keep going on about this for a long time.
Well, I would love to hear more about this. I don't know if I've got enough time for that, but can definitely do it over a couple of sometime. So I just want to ask, where can people find you and your written works and stuff? Where can people go to learn more about this subject?
So as I said at the beginning, I have an article that's come out very recently in Renaissance Studies journal. So you just you know search for that, and it's open access, so you can just read it. You don't have to like subscribe or to a university or anything like that. My thesis is also freely available. Again, you don't have to be a member of a university for it. And that's the White Rose e-theses, plural. And just, find York 2015. And yeah, that's about it, really. Social media is mostly just pictures of flowers in the cemetery, so that doesn't really help us here.
Even though they are very pretty pictures of cemeteries and flowers.
And I do write a blog as well, but it's not really about this kind of history. It's just sort of, a side interest in local stuff. But How It Was Because is the name of the blog. And yeah, just watch for more forthcoming research about early modern grammar schools.
I'm sure we will. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.